"Are you ready?" the millionaire whispered firmly to her. And that first night became an eternal story of impossible love. Where are you watching us from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like if you want to discover how a simple whisper forever changed two destinies. The scent of linden blossoms floated in Boston's warm air like a silent promise, enveloping the terrace of the Fairmont Copley Plaza in its intoxicating sweetness. Eleanor Blackwood nervously adjusted the collar of her burgundy dress, unaccustomed to finding herself among the cultural elite gathered for this conference on historical preservation. Lives sometimes intertwine like threads of an ancient tapestry, without being able to discern the pattern until it's too late to turn away, she thought while observing the distinguished crowd that populated the terrace. At 23, the young librarian had just been appointed assistant manager of the Medieval Manuscripts Department at the Morgan Library. Her presence at this event was due only to the unexpected absence of her superior. The setting sun gilded the stone facade of the Boston Public Library, visible from the terrace where she stood, an untouched champagne flute in hand. "You look about as comfortable as an illuminated manuscript left in direct sunlight," murmured a deep voice to her right. Eleanor turned, surprised by this unexpected bibliophilic reference. The man standing before her emanated a presence that seemed to occupy more than the physical space he inhabited. Tall, with graying temples, he wore a midnight blue suit whose simple elegance betrayed an exorbitant price. But it was his eyes that struck her, a luminous gray observing her with a disconcerting intensity. "A manuscript finds its value in its content, not in its exhibition frame," she responded, amazed by her own boldness. The man's lips spread into a smile, creating two unexpected dimples in his face, features chiseled by experience. "Thaddeus Montgomery," he introduced himself simply, extending a hand whose palm bore the marks of someone who hadn't always been content with signing contracts. Eleanor Blackwood. Their hands met briefly. The contact was short, but left an invisible imprint on her skin, like the stamp of a moment that would mark a before and after in the story of her life. "You're the expert in illuminated manuscripts who is presenting tomorrow's conference on conservation techniques," he stated more than asked. "I'm afraid the real expert is bedridden with the flu. I'm merely her humble replacement," Eleanor admitted. The cellist playing in the background began a melancholy yet hopeful melody by Barber. Thaddeus seemed to listen to it for a moment, his gaze lost toward the horizon where the Charles River glittered under the day's last rays. "Sometimes, Miss Blackwood, replacements are the moments when life reveals our true place to us." There was a depth in his voice suggesting each word carried the weight of lived experience. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of that strange anticipation preceding great upheavals. Night was falling over Boston, and with it, the curtain rose on a story whose scope neither could yet measure. Applause resounded through the amphitheater of the Conservation Center like a summer rain, sudden, intense, and revitalizing. Eleanor, still trembling from having spoken publicly for nearly an hour, greeted the audience with a slight nod. Her lecture on medieval pigment preservation techniques had captivated an audience she had initially imagined indifferent. As she gathered her notes, she noticed a familiar figure who hadn't left the back row. Thaddeus Montgomery remained seated, a notebook open on his knees, his gray eyes fixed on her with an indecipherable expression. He hadn't joined the hurried congratulations of the other participants who were now dispersing toward the buffet. "You were right," he said simply when she approached, the other participants having left the room. "About what?" she asked, aware of the silence settling around them, amplifying every exchanged word. "Value residing in content." He closed his notebook where she glimpsed detailed notes. "Your exposition on the symbolism of colors in 13th century manuscripts was revealing." The choice of this last word intrigued her. "Revealing of what, Mr. Montgomery?" "Of the passion hiding behind expertise." He stood up, dominating the space with his height. "I'd like to show you something. Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" The proposal, formulated with quiet confidence, caught her off guard. Eleanor hesitated, aware of the difference in age, status, everything that separated them. And yet, "I finish my shift at the library at 4, she replied, surprised by her own temerity. "I'll wait for you at the entrance to the Boston Public Garden, near the George Washington statue at 4:30. Thaddeus wasn't smiling, but something in his gaze had softened, like a winter landscape at spring's first breath. The next day, a brisk wind swept through Boston's streets, making shutters clatter and dead leaves twirl in a frenetic dance. Eleanor pulled her wool scarf over her nose, already regretting accepting this improbable appointment. She quickly spotted Thaddeus's figure near the statue, unperturbed by the wind that battered the century-old trees. "I almost didn't come," she confessed without preamble. "But you're here." His observation was devoid of triumph, a simple acknowledgement of fact. "What did you have to show me that required braving this storm?" she asked, breathless after climbing toward the garden perched above the city. In response, he handed her a worn leather case. "Open it." Her fingers, slightly numb from the cold, unfastened the clasp with caution. Inside rested a small book bound in red morocco, visibly ancient. With precise professional gestures, she opened it delicately. "My God," she murmured, immediately recognizing the work. "It's a 15th-century Book of Hours. These illuminations, the gold leaf technique, it's extraordinary." Thaddeus observed her face rather than the book. "It belonged to my grandmother. I understand the Morgan Library is seeking to complete its medieval collection." Eleanor raised her eyes to him, suddenly understanding. "You're considering donating it?" "On condition that a competent person supervises its conservation," he specified. "Someone who understands these pages contain more than pigments and parchment." The wind had momentarily calmed, as if offering them a truce in this garden, suspended between earth and sky. "Why me?" she finally asked, reverently closing the work. "Because I saw your gaze light up when you spoke about the symbolism of ultramarine blue." It wasn't the gaze of a technician, but that of a guardian. These words struck her with the force of a long-sought truth. No one had ever seen beyond her technical skills to recognize what truly animated her, that almost spiritual connection with testimonies of the past. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" Thaddeus's question came to interrupt the thread of her thoughts. "We could discuss the modalities of this donation." In Boston's sky, clouds were dispersing, to reveal a blue as pure as that of the illuminations she so cherished. Eleanor felt she stood on the threshold of a new chapter. "I accept," she responded simply. The Morgan Library resembled a buzzing hive that morning. Workers in coveralls installed scaffolding in the West Wing, while architects consulted plans spread out on enormous tables. Eleanor traversed this unusual chaos, distractedly greeting colleagues, her mind still occupied by the previous evening's dinner with Thaddeus. "Miss Blackwood!" The shrill voice of Professor Harrington, the director, yanked her from her thoughts. "Come to my office immediately." Intrigued, she followed her superior to the small room that smelled of coffee and old papers. Without preamble, he handed her a folder bearing the seal of an architectural firm. "Can you explain how you accomplished this miracle?" he asked, half accusatory, half admiring. "What miracle, Professor?" she asked, genuinely perplexed. "The Montgomery Foundation has just approved a $3 million funding for the complete restoration of our manuscript department, and according to this document, you'll be the project's principal consultant." The shock left her speechless. $3 million. Thaddeus hadn't mentioned this colossal donation during their dinner, merely discussing the Book of Hours and his passion for medieval architecture. "I did indeed meet Mr. Montgomery during the conference," she stammered, disconcerted. The director removed his glasses, eyeing her with a new respect mixed with wariness. "Whatever your persuasion talents, they're remarkable. The board of directors is meeting this afternoon to meet the architects. Your presence is required." The day passed in a fog of incredulity. The plans revealed a major transformation, contemporary glass ceiling preserving the authenticity of the Renaissance vaults, cutting-edge conservation systems, and a completely redesigned reading room. Her name appeared on every document as principal consultant. Leaving the library that evening, a dull anger had replaced her initial surprise. In the golden light of the New England dusk, she glimpsed Thaddeus's figure waiting for her, leaning against his car. "How dare you?" she confronted him without preamble, approaching with large strides, his impassive face colored with slight surprise. "You're not satisfied with the plans?" "That's not the question. You manipulated me." Her voice trembled with indignation. "You orchestrated all this behind my back, making me appear as what exactly?" "Your protégé. Your acquisition." Thaddeus took the accusation without flinching, but a shadow crossed his gaze, "I thought I was surprising you," he said calmly. "The library needs this restoration, and you're the most qualified person to supervise the project." "Don't take me for an idiot. One doesn't make a $3 million donation to impress a simple librarian." The wind had risen, making her auburn hair whirl around her flushed face. For the first time she saw Thaddeus hesitate, as if measuring the weight of the words he was about to utter. "Get in the car, please," he finally asked. "I'd like to show you something." "Another surprise?" she said ironically. An explanation. Something in his tone, an unexpected vulnerability, made her yield. The journey unfolded in tense silence. The car left Boston, winding through hills until stopping before the imposing ruins of a Romanesque abbey that the setting sun tinted with ochre and amber. "The Abbey of St. Vincent," Thaddeus introduced, opening her door. "My first restoration project, 20 years ago." They walked side by side between the gutted walls, where nature had reclaimed its rights, wild vines wrapping around millennial columns. "I was ruined," he continued softly. "My wife had just died after a long illness that had swallowed all our savings. My children were still teenagers. This project was my last chance." Eleanor felt her anger soften in the face of this unexpected confidence. "A heritage conservator believed in my vision," he continued, touching the ancient stone with a respectful hand. "He guided me, taught me to respect the soul of places while infusing them with new life. Without him, I wouldn't be here today." The fading light drew long shadows on the ground strewn with dead leaves. "I'm not trying to buy you, Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I'm trying to give you the opportunity someone offered me when I desperately needed it." The silence that followed was charged with the weight of this confession, the scent of cypresses, and the earth still warm despite the late hour. "I want to be clear," she finally responded. "If I accept, it will be solely for the library's benefit, not for you." An almost imperceptible smile brushed Thaddeus's lips. "I expect nothing less." In the sky, the first stars appeared, silent witnesses to a pact whose implications neither yet fully measured. The renovation project was proceeding at a sustained pace, gradually transforming the library into a strange mix of dusty construction site and high-tech laboratory. Eleanor juggled between her usual responsibilities and her new consultant duties, often working until the late hours in the bluish light of her computer. Her colleagues now looked at her differently. Conversations stopped at her approach, resuming in whispers as soon as she walked away. Even Vivian, her friend since university, seemed distant, responding with monosyllables to her attempts at conversation. "So you've changed," Vivian finally blurted out one noon, as they lunched on a bench in the small cloister adjacent to the library. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, surprised by this frontal attack. "Don't you see?" Vivian pushed a blonde lock from her face, revealing an accusatory gaze. "Suddenly you're the rising star, the protégé of the great Thaddeus Montgomery. Even your way of dressing has changed." Eleanor lowered her eyes to her dress, a simple but elegant model she had treated herself to with her recent raise. "I remain the same person," she defended. "I just have more responsibilities now, and more privileges." Vivian's tone was sharp as broken glass. "Do you think no one notices your little professional appointments? The long discussions in his glass office where everyone can see you." "We talk about the project," Eleanor exclaimed, feeling the blush rise to her cheeks. "It's purely professional." Vivian's laughter sounded false. "Of course, that's what everyone says. A young librarian and a multi-millionaire patron 25 years her senior. Absolutely nothing but professional discussions." The cruelty of these words struck her like a slap. "I thought you knew me better than that." "I thought I knew you, period." Vivian gathered her bag. "Harrington is organizing an emergency meeting this afternoon. Apparently your benefactor is coming to make a surprise visit to the site." Left alone, Eleanor contemplated the crumbs of her sandwich, her appetite gone. She hadn't been informed of this visit, an omission that troubled her more than she wanted to admit. When she returned to the library, a black limousine was parked in front of the entrance, attracting curious glances from passers-by. Inside, she found Thaddeus, surrounded by a group of men in suits, animatedly discussing the plans spread on a table. "Ah, Miss Blackwood." Professor Harrington welcomed her with an obsequiousness that made her uncomfortable. "We were just discussing Phase 2 of the project." "Phase 2?" she repeated, lost. "I thought we had only one phase planned." The men's gazes converged on her. A mix of surprise and condescension. Only Thaddeus's remained indecipherable. "Mr. Montgomery plans to extend the project to acquire the adjacent building," Harrington explained. "A major expansion that would double our storage capacity and allow the creation of a modern auditorium." Eleanor felt a wave of heat invade her. Not of excitement, but anger. She had spent weeks perfecting every detail of the initial project, and now they were redesigning the plans without even consulting her. "If you'll excuse us," she said with forced calm, "I'd like to speak with Mr. Montgomery privately." "Regarding the Carolingian manuscripts," she added to justify this request. Thaddeus nodded imperceptibly, and the other men dispersed with that deference commanded by money. "Why didn't you tell me anything?" she attacked as soon as they were alone. "The decision was made this morning," he responded calmly, "and it didn't occur to you that I should have been consulted. I'm supposed to be the principal consultant on this project." A flash of irritation crossed Thaddeus's gaze. "It's my money, Eleanor, my project. So I'm just a facade." She felt her voice falter. "A pretty ornament to give cultural credibility to your real estate ambitions?" He approached her, invading her personal space. "Is that really what you think?" The silence stretched between them, electric, laden with unspoken words and contradictory emotions. "I don't know what to think anymore," she finally admitted. "My colleagues look at me as if I've made a Faustian pact. Even my best friend insinuates that—" She broke off, unable to formulate Vivian's implicit accusation. "That we're lovers," he completed without circumlocution. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. "That's not the case. Not yet." The frankness of these last 3 words left her speechless. Thaddeus held her gaze without blinking. "I never mix business and pleasure," he continued. "But I won't deny that I find you fascinating, Eleanor, well beyond your professional competencies." Heart beating, she stepped back, seeking to regain composure. "I can't continue like this," she declared. "Not under these conditions. Either we establish clear boundaries, or I withdraw from the project." An enigmatic smile appeared on Thaddeus's face. "What do you propose?" "First, I must be consulted on all decisions. Second, our meetings will always take place in the presence of others. And third," she hesitated, searching for words. "Have dinner with me Saturday," he interrupted, "at my home. We'll discuss your third condition there." "That would be inappropriate," she protested weakly. "It would be honest," he corrected. "Away from prying eyes and rumors, just you and me facing this situation." The tension between them was almost palpable, as if the air itself had charged with electricity. "All right," she finally yielded. "Saturday." Through the glass door she glimpsed Vivian's face watching them, living confirmation of everything she had just denied. Thaddeus's mansion stood on the heights of Beacon Hill, overlooking the Charles River, and offering an unparalleled view of illuminated Boston in the night. Eleanor, having dismissed the chauffeur who had come to collect her, remained a moment motionless before the wrought-iron gate, hesitant. The white gravel crunched under her steps as she ascended the alley bordered by century-old oak trees, their silvery foliage rustling in the night breeze. It wasn't the ostentatious opulence she had imagined. The residence, an ancient New England colonial restored with exquisite taste, integrated harmoniously into the landscape. The golden stones seemed to absorb the day's light, to gently release it in the twilight. Thaddeus awaited her on the porch, dressed with elegant simplicity. White shirt, dark trousers. Without jacket or tie, he appeared different, perhaps more accessible. "Welcome," he said simply, inviting her in with a gesture. The interior surprised her equally. Instead of the flashy luxury she mentally associated with wealth, she discovered rooms with harmonious proportions, where books dominated, carefully chosen art objects, and antique furniture patinated by time. "It's not what you expected," he observed, amused by her expression. "I don't know exactly what I expected," she admitted, stopping before a bookcase occupying an entire wall. "Champagne in marble bathtubs, masterpieces hung without discernment." She smiled despite herself. "Perhaps. Sorry to disappoint." He guided her to a terrace overlooking a formal garden where an intimate dinner had been set. A single table, 2 place settings, candles flickering in the gentle breeze, and in the background, Boston gradually illuminating as day declined. "It's magnificent," she murmured, sincere. "I restored this house stone by stone," Thaddeus explained. pulling out a chair for her. "It was my first personal acquisition after my professional successes." The wine he served, a Napa Valley Cabernet of an exceptional vintage, seemed to capture the very essence of the terroir that stretched at their feet. The conversation naturally drifted towards architecture, literature, the history of the region they both knew intimately, albeit for different reasons. It was only at dessert that Thaddeus broached the subject that had motivated this invitation. "You never formulated your third condition," he reminded, rotating his glass between his fingers. Eleanor took a deep breath. The wine and intimate atmosphere had somewhat blunted her defenses, but she remained determined. "My third condition is transparency," she declared. "I want to know why you're doing all this. The truth, not a sugar-coated or strategic version." A silence settled, punctuated only by the song of crickets and the distant murmur of the river. "Follow me," he finally said, rising. He led her through the house to a room she hadn't yet seen, evidently his study. The space was dominated by a large desk covered with plans and documents, and by an entire wall of framed photographs. Thaddeus approached a small display case in a corner and extracted an object he handed to her with unusual reverence. It was a book, but not just any book, a manuscript, bound in leather worn by centuries. "Journal of Brother Thomas, Scribe of St. Vincent's Monastery, 1253, she read on the first page, her librarian's heart accelerating. "Turn the pages," he gently encouraged. She discovered detailed sketches of a building, technical notes on construction, orientation, materials to use. "It's," she began, incredulous. "The original plans for what is today the Morgan Library," Thaddeus confirmed. "The monastery was transformed during the colonial era, then modified several times, but the medieval skeleton is still there beneath subsequent additions." Eleanor turned the pages with caution, fascinated by this discovery. "Look at the benefactor's name," he indicated, pointing to an annotation at the bottom of a page. The words, written in brown ink, in meticulous calligraphy, jumped out at her. "By the grace and generosity of Lord William Montgomery, Knight of the Massachusetts Bay Colony." She raised a stunned gaze to Thaddeus. "An ancestor. Direct, according to the genealogical research I had done. The construction of this library is, in some way, a family matter unfinished for 800 years. The revelation left her speechless, all her suspicions suddenly reduced to nothing in the face of this unexpected historical connection. "Why not say so earlier?" Thaddeus turned away, observing the illuminated city from the window. "Because I wanted you to see the project for what it is, not as the eccentricity of a rich heir obsessed with his lineage." There was a vulnerability in his voice she had never perceived before. "And because I hoped you would learn to know me for who I am, not for what I possess." These last words, almost whispered, resonated in the room's silence with the force of a long-held confession. Eleanor felt something yield within her, a resistance, a distrust she had erected like a wall between them. "I'm beginning to know you, Thaddeus," she responded softly. Their gazes crossed in the penumbra, laden with a mutual recognition that surpassed words. Outside, Boston's lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth, silent witnesses to a pivotal moment when past and present joined in a promise of future still undefined. "And this part of the manuscript clearly demonstrates Byzantine influence on New England illumination techniques," Eleanor animatedly explained to a group of international visitors. "Note how gold is applied in successive layers to create a particular luminosity." The 6 weeks that had elapsed since the evening at Thaddeus's house had transformed the library. The first phase of renovation was nearing completion, revealing spaces bathed in light, where the most advanced technologies harmoniously coexisted with the enhanced historic structures. Eleanor had found her bearings in this new role, progressively earning her colleagues' respect through her expertise and dedication. Even Vivian seemed to have softened her judgment, though their friendship remained tinged with a new reserve. As for her relationship with Thaddeus, it had evolved into a professional partnership, marked by mutual respect and growing complicity. They saw each other almost daily for the project, always in the presence of others, scrupulously respecting the conditions she had set. Yet something had changed between them. Lingering glances, fingers that accidentally brushed while exchanging documents, particular attention to each word the other spoke. After escorting the visitors, Eleanor returned to her new office, a bright room overlooking a recently restored inner courtyard. A bouquet of fresh peonies graced her desk, as every Monday morning for a month. No card, no message, just these flowers, whose delicacy seemed to mock the conventions they imposed on themselves. She was distractedly touching the silky petals when her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Beacon Hill Cafe, 5 p.m. Important information regarding TM, come alone. Intrigued and vaguely worried, she left the library at the appointed hour. The cafe, located in a winding street of Old Boston, was almost deserted at this hour. In a corner, a man in his 50s, with the sober appearance of a civil servant, made a discreet sign to her. "Miss Blackwood," he greeted without introducing himself. "Thank you for coming." "Who are you?" she asked directly. "My identity is unimportant. I work for the Montgomery family, more precisely for Thaddeus's children." This revelation caught her off guard. Thaddeus rarely mentioned his family, and she had respected this reserve. "What do you want?" The man pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "You're not the first, you know." "Excuse me?" The young protégé, the promising collaborator. His tone was clinical, devoid of emotion. "Thaddeus Montgomery has a pattern he regularly reproduces." With slightly trembling hands, Eleanor opened the envelope. It contained photographs. Thaddeus with different women, all young, in professional situations similar to hers. Newspaper clippings evoked his collaborations with an architect in Chicago, a curator in Philadelphia, an art historian in San Francisco. "These are professional relationships," she objected, a knot in her throat. "Of course," the man conceded, with a smile devoid of warmth. "At first. Then come the flowers without a card, the private invitations, the carefully orchestrated personal confidences. A predictable pattern." A sensation of cold invaded Eleanor, as if the room's temperature had suddenly plummeted. "Why show me this?" "The Montgomery family wishes to protect its interests. Thaddeus's sentimental distractions have already cost several millions in abandoned projects and amicable settlements." He produced a second document, a check for an astronomical amount. "Compensation for your discreet departure from the project. You could work anywhere with such a recommendation. Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle." Eleanor abruptly stood up, nearly knocking over her cup. "I'm not for sale." "Think about it," the man insisted, slipping his card into the envelope. "These opportunities don't present themselves twice." She left the cafe, the envelope clutched in her bag like a contaminated object. Night was falling over Boston, transforming the alleys into labyrinths of shadows and flickering lights. Without thinking, she headed toward the public garden, seeking in the height and calm a space to order her chaotic thoughts. Seated on a bench facing the illuminated State House, she examined the photographs again, searching in the smiling faces for confirmation or refutation of the accusations. Doubts infiltrated her like a slow poison. What if everything had been just an illusion? A repeated scenario, an expert manipulation of which she was merely the latest victim? Her phone vibrated, a message from Thaddeus. "Unexpected meeting tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Could you prepare the presentation for the Heritage Commission?" TM. Professional, distant, perfectly innocent. Like all their recent communications. She didn't respond, staring at the screen until it turned off, plunging her back into penumbra. The wind had risen, making the cypresses shiver like uneasy sentinels in the night. A decision imposed itself, but every option seemed impracticable. Confronting Thaddeus with these sordid accusations, accepting the family's offer, continuing as if nothing had happened while ignoring the doubts now gnawing at her. Under indifferent stars, Eleanor felt the weight of a choice that far exceeded the professional realm to touch the very essence of what she had become in these last months, and what she risked losing. The conference room buzzed with activity when Eleanor entered the next morning, her eyes circled after an almost sleepless night. Thaddeus was already there, in deep conversation with the chief architect and two representatives of the Heritage Commission. He gave her a professional nod, but she perceived the flash of concern that crossed his gaze upon noting her tired appearance. The meeting unfolded, as if in a fog. Eleanor mechanically presented the historical aspects of the project, her voice sounding strangely detached to her own ears. Several times she intercepted Thaddeus's questioning gaze, but she systematically averted her eyes, unable to sustain this visual contact. that until yesterday had given her a thrill of anticipation. "Miss Blackwood, could you stay a moment?" Thaddeus asked as the room began to empty. Eleanor hesitated, torn between the confrontation she knew was inevitable and the desire to flee. "I have another appointment," she lied, gathering her documents. "5 minutes," he gently insisted. "Please." When the door closed behind the last participant, a heavy silence settled between them. "Something's wrong," Thaddeus stated, direct as usual. "Everything's fine," she responded coldly. "Eleanor." He approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "We know each other well enough now to recognize when the other is lying." This phrase, this presumption of intimacy, made something give way within her. With a brusque gesture, she opened her bag and extracted the envelope, almost throwing it on the table. "Do we really know each other, Thaddeus? Or am I just a new name in your collection?" He stared at the envelope without opening it, his face suddenly closed. "You've met Redgrave. Your little family detective." "Yes, we had a fascinating conversation about your habits." Thaddeus passed a hand over his face, a gesture of weariness she had never seen in him. "It's not what you think. Really. Because the photographs seem quite explicit. Professional collaborators," he confirmed, "but not conquests. And the abandoned projects? The amicable settlements?" A flash of anger passed through Thaddeus's eyes. "My son Griffin has always had a fertile imagination and a certain talent for distorting facts." He approached the window, contemplating the construction site below, where workers bustled like ants. "I had a relationship 3 years ago," he finally admitted, "with a woman my age, divorced like me. Nothing scandalous, nothing premeditated. She did work on one of my projects, but our relationship began much later." He turned to her, his direct gaze challenging her to doubt his words. "When I ended this relationship, she threatened to file a harassment lawsuit. False accusations, but my reputation would have been tarnished, and above all, the cultural project we were working on would have been compromised. I paid for her silence, a mistake my children don't forgive me for." Eleanor wanted to believe him desperately, but the doubts instilled by Redgrave persisted. "And the other women in these photos?" "Verify for yourself. Call them. Ask if I ever had inappropriate behavior." The sincerity that transpired in his voice shook her newly acquired certainties. "Why would your children do this?" she asked, still seeking an explanation. Thaddeus laughed without joy. "Money. Always money. They fear my, let's say, sentimental attachments will squander their inheritance on projects they deem useless. Like the library." "Like the library," he confirmed. "Like all the heritage restorations I've financed these last 20 years, which, according to them, are financial black holes without return on investment." He approached her, stopping a few inches away, close enough for her to perceive his familiar scent, but without touching her. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it, Eleanor. Do your own research. But know one thing. What's developing between us, whatever it is real. At least on my side." The intensity of his gaze, the vulnerability in his voice, everything cried out truth. "And yet, I need time," she murmured, "to reflect." "Take it," he agreed, "but don't let others define what we are, or what we could be." Eleanor left the room, her heart beating and her mind in turmoil. In the corridor, she crossed paths with Professor Harrington, who hailed her. "Ah, Miss Blackwood, I have excellent news. The Library of Congress is offering you a position as assistant curator for their new medieval wing. An exceptional opportunity. The timing of this offer, coming right after her meeting with the detective, couldn't be a coincidence." "Who contacted you about this?" she asked directly. The director appeared disconcerted. "A certain Mr. Redgrave, from the Department of Culture, I believe. He mentioned you were already aware." Eleanor felt a cold anger invade her. The manipulations thus extended well beyond simple insinuations. "I'll think about it," she responded with forced calm. That evening, in her small apartment, she did what Thaddeus had suggested. She researched each of the women in the photographs, easily finding their professional profiles. Calls were made, messages sent, frank and direct. The responses, arriving in the following hours, all converged toward the same truth. Thaddeus Montgomery was a demanding but respectful collaborator, a generous patron who had transformed careers without ever demanding anything in return. One response in particular from the Chicago architect struck her. The Montgomery family approached me too when I began working with Thaddeus. Don't let their paranoia destroy something precious, whether it's a professional project or something more personal. Outside, rain had begun to fall, washing Boston streets and drumming against her windows like the echo of her tumultuous thoughts. A decision was slowly crystallizing within her, like those stalactites formed drop by drop in the darkness of caves, invisible until a light suddenly reveals their fragile beauty and unsuspected strength. The news fell like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Imminent bankruptcy of Montgomery Group, real estate magnate on the brink of ruin. The Boston Globe headlines dominated all the city's newsstands, accompanied by photos of Thaddeus hurriedly leaving a meeting, his face closed. Eleanor, who had been about to contact him after her night of reflection, stood petrified before the newsstand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she paid for the newspaper, feverishly seeking details in the inner pages. The article detailed a series of risky investments, a brutal downturn in the luxury real estate market, and increasingly pressing creditors. Several projects were mentioned as suspended until further notice. The library renovation topped the list. At the library, the atmosphere was electric. Groups of colleagues whispered in the corridors, dispersing at her approach like frightened sparrows. Professor Harrington awaited her in his office, his face grave. "It's a disaster," he announced without preamble. "The second installment of funding won't be paid. The department speaks of taking over the project, but with a budget divided by 3 and a timetable extended over 10 years instead of 2. Eleanor sat down slowly, assimilating the information. "Do we have direct news from the Montgomery Foundation?" "No official communication." The director removed his glasses, nervously wiping them. "But unofficially, I'm told Montgomery has been unreachable since yesterday. He reportedly left the country precipitously." This last piece of information struck her like a slap. Gone? Without a word, without an explanation. "There must be a mistake," she murmured. "Eleanor," Harrington sighed with unusual sympathy, "I understand your professional disappointment. This project represented an exceptional opportunity for your career, but we must be realistic. These billionaires live in another world. They build and destroy according to their whims." She left the office, deaf to her superior's calls. In a daze, she returned to her workspace where an envelope awaited her. An express mail from the Department of Culture confirming the job offer in Washington, with a salary that far exceeded her current expectations. The coincidence seemed too perfect, as if everything had been orchestrated to distance her from Boston and from Thaddeus precisely at this moment. She tried calling the personal number he had given her in case of emergency, straight to voicemail. Her emails remained unanswered. Even the Foundation's secretariat seemed to have ceased all activity, responding with a laconic automatic message. 3 days passed thus, in a fog of uncertainty and growing concern. Work at the library had abruptly halted, leaving the building in a state of uncomfortable transition, neither completely renovated nor returned to its original state. On the 4th day, as she was about to return home after a morally exhausting day, Vivian appeared at her door, visibly uncomfortable. "There's someone who wants to see you," she announced in a half voice. "At the service entrance." "Who?" He wouldn't give me his name, but he said it was important and personal. Heart beating, Eleanor rushed to the small hidden door that opened onto an adjacent alley. It wasn't Thaddeus waiting for her, but a young man with familiar features, a younger, harder version of the face she had come to know. "Griffin Montgomery," he introduced himself with a brief nod. "We should talk elsewhere." They walked in silence to a small public garden deserted at this hour. Thaddeus's son seemed nervous, regularly checking over his shoulder as if fearing being followed. "My father is ruined," he announced abruptly. "The newspapers already announced that," Eleanor responded with a touch of bitterness. "What I'd like to know is why he disappeared without a word." Griffin laughed without joy. "He doesn't even know you're looking for him. His personal accounts have been frozen. His communications are monitored. He's practically under house arrest at our chalet in Colorado, while lawyers try to limit the damage." Eleanor's confusion must have shown on her face, because Griffin continued, more softly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We, my sister and I, just wanted him to stop these ruinous restoration projects to focus on more profitable investments. We put pressure on some of his financial partners, suggested rumors of instability." He passed a nervous hand through his hair, a gesture painfully reminiscent of Thaddeus to Eleanor. Things got out of hand, a domino effect we hadn't foreseen. A cold anger invaded Eleanor. You deliberately sabotaged your own father. We wanted to protect him from himself, Griffin defended. In recent years, he swallowed fortunes in projects without profitability, obsessed with preserving a heritage that yields nothing. And then there was you. Me, she repeated, incredulous. When we saw he was growing attached to you, we believed it was like the last time, an expensive distraction. So we hired Redgrave to get rid of me, she completed, the puzzle pieces finally assembling. But why tell me all this now? Griffin's face suddenly decomposed, losing its mask of confidence to reveal a vulnerability that made him appear very young. Because he refuses to fight, he murmured. For the first time in his life, my father is giving up. He says he accepts losing everything, that he'll start from scratch if necessary. But there's one thing he regrets. What? Eleanor breathed, her heart beating. Not having had the courage to tell you what he truly felt before it was too late. The silence that followed was laden with contradictory emotions. Shock, anger, but also a strange form of hope. Where is he exactly? She finally asked, a new determination in her voice. Griffin extracted an envelope from his jacket, quite different from the one Redgrave had given her. All the information is here. Also a plane ticket if you decide to go. Before she could respond, he added, He doesn't know I came. If you choose to disappear from his life, he'll understand. He rose, visibly uncomfortable in this romantic messenger role so far removed from his previous maneuvers. For what it's worth, he added as he left, I've never seen my father look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not even my mother when she was alive. Eleanor remained long on that bench, the envelope in her hands as the day's last lights faded over Boston, colouring the ancient stones with a golden pink that seemed to whisper that even ruins could be beautiful in the right light. The chalet stood on the mountainside, modest compared to the luxurious residences that dotted the heights of Aspen. From the weathered wooden terrace, one could see the Colorado Rockies, whose snow-capped peaks stood out against a sky of an almost painful blue. The silence was disturbed only by the occasional tinkling of bells from the hiking trails below. Eleanor hesitated at the door, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The journey had been long, a flight to Denver, then a small commuter plane, and finally a taxi that had dropped her at the foot of a forest path. The last 100 yards she had traversed on foot, her small suitcase tracing a furrow in the fresh snow. 3 hesitant knocks, no response. She knocked again, harder this time. Slow footsteps were heard, then the door opened. Thaddeus stood before her, almost unrecognizable. A several-day beard darkened his gaunt face, and his eyes, usually so lively, seemed extinguished. He wore an old wool sweater and canvas pants, far from the sober elegance to which she had grown accustomed. Eleanor? His incredulity was palpable. How? Your son, she explained simply. A flash of surprise crossed his gaze. Without a word, he stepped aside to let her enter. The chalet's interior was warm but Spartan, far from the luxury of his Boston mansion. A fire died slowly in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Books littered a rustic coffee table beside a half-empty coffee cup. I wasn't expecting you, he finally said, as if to apologize for the disorder. Evidently. An uncomfortable silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words and pending questions. Why did you leave without saying anything? She asked directly. Thaddeus sighed, passing a tired hand over his face. I thought to spare you the public humiliation. My name is now associated with failure, bankruptcy. Everything I touch crumbles, including the library. Especially the library, he confirmed bitterly. The project closest to my heart. He revived the fire, adding a log with methodical gestures that betrayed a recent habit. Griffin told me everything, Eleanor revealed. How your children orchestrated your downfall. A sad smile brushed Thaddeus's lips. Perhaps they accelerated the process, but the shipwreck was inevitable. I took too many risks in recent years, invested in projects out of passion rather than reason. And now, he shrugged, I wait. The lawyers negotiate. At best, I'll have enough left to live modestly. At worst, he let his sentence hang, contemplating the flames. This isn't the man I knew speaking, Eleanor observed. The Thaddeus Montgomery I know doesn't give up. Perhaps you don't know me as well as you think. On the contrary, she approached, reducing the physical distance that symbolized their emotional separation. I know the man who rebuilt his life after losing everything a first time, the one who sees beauty and value where others see only ruins. Something awakened in Thaddeus's eyes, a spark that revived the extinguished grey of his gaze. "Why did you come, Eleanor?" he asked softly. She could have mentioned the library, the future of the project, 1,000 professional reasons that would have sounded false. Instead, she chose the naked truth. "Because since you left, I no longer see colors," she admitted. "The manuscripts I so loved seem to have lost their luster. The words I read no longer resonate." She took another step toward him. "I came because I realized you aren't a chapter in my story. You've become the very ink with which it's written." The confession, so direct, so vulnerable, seemed to completely disarm Thaddeus. He remained motionless, as if fearing a gesture might break this moment suspended between two possible lives. "I'm 48, he murmured. "You're 23. I'm ruined, disgraced. What can I offer you now?" "I didn't come seeking offerings," she responded with firm gentleness. "I came to remind you who you are, and perhaps also to discover who I could be at your side." Outside, snow had resumed falling, enveloping the chalet in a cocoon of immaculate silence. In the fireplace, a log suddenly collapsed, sending a spray of sparks that briefly illuminated the room. It was Thaddeus who took the last step, reducing to nothing the distance still separating them. His hand brushed Eleanor's cheek with an almost painful tenderness. "I don't deserve this second chance," he whispered. "It's not for you to judge," she replied before rising on tiptoe to kiss him. This first kiss tasted of possibilities rediscovered, uncertain beginnings, and unspoken promises. Far from Boston and its ancient stones, in the heart of indifferent mountains, two souls separated by age and experience, but united by mutual recognition, finally found their anchorage point. The snow had stopped falling, giving way to brilliant sunshine that transformed the alpine landscape into a crystal kingdom. Seated on the chalet's terrace despite the cold, Eleanor and Thaddeus shared a late breakfast, their fingers entwined on the rustic table, as if to ensure the proximity discovered the previous evening wasn't just a dream. "I have something to show you," Thaddeus announced, after a moment of comfortable silence. He disappeared inside and returned with a worn notebook he handed her with unusual hesitation. "My journal," he explained. "The last 3 weeks." Eleanor opened it with caution, touched by this proof of trust. The pages were covered with the dense, elegant handwriting she had learned to recognize on project notes. But these lines didn't speak of figures or plans. They were sketches of life, deep reflections on failure, loss, and above all, entire pages dedicated to her. "I wonder if she still thinks of me," she read aloud, moved. "If she understands it's out of respect for her that I eclipsed myself without explanation, to spare her the humiliation of seeing her name associated with mine in this debacle." She turned the pages, discovering his doubts, his silent hopes, and a progressive acceptance of loss that transpired in increasingly stripped-down phrases. The last entry, dated the day before, contained only one line. "I had abandoned all hope, and perhaps that's when she appeared, as if the universe waited for me to renounce to grant me what I believed myself unworthy of." Eleanor gently closed the notebook, her eyes bright with contained emotion. "I was never good with words when it comes to feelings," Thaddeus admitted. "I write them to avoid saying them. Cowardice, perhaps. Modesty," she gently corrected. "Which I understand better than you imagine." A phone's ringtone broke this moment of intimacy. Thaddeus apologized with a glance before answering, his face instantly regaining the concentration of business. The conversation, punctuated by long silences, during which he listened with increasing intensity. When he finally hung up, his expression had transformed. "My lawyer in New York," he explained. "The negotiations are taking an unexpected turn." "Good or bad?" Eleanor asked, concerned by his indecipherable air. "Both, I suppose." He sat back down, visibly trying to order his thoughts. "A Middle Eastern investor proposes to buy the majority of my real estate assets for a substantial sum, sufficient to repay my creditors and maintain a solid financial base." "That's excellent news," she exclaimed. "Not entirely." His gaze lost itself in the distant mountains. The main condition is that I commit as an exclusive consultant for their development projects in the UAE. A 5-year contract, non-negotiable. The implication struck her immediately. You would have to leave the United States. Leave North America, he specified. Establish myself in Dubai. A heavy silence fell between them, laden with barely formulated promises that already seemed to crumble. You should accept, Eleanor finally said, her voice firm despite the pain compressing her chest. Thaddeus looked at her with surprise. Without hesitation? Your reputation, your financial dignity, your ability to rebuild, everything depends on this decision. She forced a smile despite the knot forming in her throat. It's not as if we had made concrete plans. No, he admitted softly. Not yet. This not yet floated between them, heavy with all that could have been and perhaps would never be. When should they receive your response? She asked, practical despite the emotional storm raging within her. Tomorrow at noon. Thaddeus rose, unable to remain still. I should be relieved. It's an outcome far more favorable than anything I hoped for. And yet, she repeated, perfectly understanding what he left unsaid. The rest of the day passed in a strange melancholy. They walked in the snow, talked about everything except the immediate future, and abandoned themselves to a tenderness tinged with urgency, as if each gesture should be engraved in their memory. As night fell, lying before the fire in an improvised nest of blankets, Eleanor broke the contemplative silence that had settled. I too received an offer, she revealed. A position at the Library of Congress in Washington, assistant curator for the new medieval wing. An exceptional opportunity, Thaddeus murmured, his fingers distractedly tracing arabesques on her bare arm. Arranged by your son, she specified, initially to distance me from you. A sad smile played on Thaddeus's lips. The irony is almost poetic. I should accept it, she said, a deliberate echo of his own words hours earlier. You should, he confirmed. Their gazes met in the amber half-light, aware of the cruel symmetry of their situations, him eastward, her southward, their trajectories inevitably diverging after this brief convergence. 5 years, she murmured. The time to establish my professional reputation. The time to secure my financial future, he responded in the same tone. An eternity, she breathed. A blink in a lifetime, he countered, his hand finding hers in the growing darkness. Outside, the wind had risen, making the chalet's wooden structure groan as if sharing their silent torment. The night stretched before them, precious and insufficient at once, prelude to a separation that seemed inevitable despite all that had just been born between them. Washington was awakening under a fine rain that gave Pennsylvania Avenue the air of an impressionist painting. From the window of her small Georgetown apartment, Eleanor contemplated this daily spectacle with a mixture of familiarity and eternal discovery. 8 months had passed since Colorado. 8 months since she had accepted the position at the Library of Congress. 8 months since Thaddeus had left for Dubai, leaving behind an unformulated promise and a suspended future. Their communication had established itself according to a precise ritual, a weekly email detailed and personal without being intimate, like a letter from another time. No phone, no video conference, a mutual choice they had never really explained, but which seemed to protect the fragile connection they maintained despite the distance. Her phone vibrated. A message from her colleague Vanessa, reminding her of the exceptional meeting convened by the director. Eleanor sighed, quickly donning her jacket before slipping under her umbrella to face the persistent drizzle. The Library of Congress rose, imposing and solemn, at the end of Independence Avenue. In 8 months, Eleanor had made a name for herself, her expertise in medieval manuscripts and modern vision of conservation, having quickly impressed the institution's old guard. The apparently urgent meeting gathered the entire manuscript department in the conference room. The director, Professor Caldwell, a man of almost caricatural solemnity, stood before a projection screen. Dear colleagues, he began in his monotonous voice, I have the immense pleasure of announcing that our medieval wing extension project has just received exceptional funding. Excited murmurs ran through the assembly. The project, ambitious but constantly postponed for lack of funds, was the dream of many conservators present. An international foundation dedicated to World Heritage preservation has chosen our institution as the beneficiary of a $20 million donation. The murmurs transformed into astonished exclamations. Such a considerable sum was unprecedented. "The project will be supervised by a committee of international experts," the director continued, "whose president does us the honor of being among us today." The door opened at the back of the room, and Eleanor felt her heart stop. Thaddeus stood there, impeccable in a dark suit, thinner perhaps but still haloed by that magnetic presence that seemed to transform the space around him. Their gazes crossed above the sea of heads, turning to glimpse the mysterious benefactor. An imperceptible smile brushed his lips, a private greeting in this public moment. The presentation continued, but Eleanor heard nothing more, captive to an emotional storm that left her dizzy. What was he doing in Washington? How had he orchestrated this donation without her knowing? And above all, what did it mean for them? When the meeting ended in an atmosphere of general excitement, she remained seated, unable to join her colleagues' movement as they pressed around Thaddeus to congratulate and question him. It took almost an hour before he managed to politely extract himself from this attention to join her. She hadn't moved, as if time had suspended itself awaiting this moment. "Hello, Eleanor," he said simply, his voice making strings vibrate within her that she thought she had muted. "You could have warned me," she responded, surprised by the implicit accusation in her own voice. "And miss that expression on your face." His smile widened. Impossible. A charged silence settled between them. 8 months of unspoken words, suddenly seeking an outlet. "Let's walk," he proposed. "The rain has stopped." They left the library side by side, maintaining a professional distance under colleagues' curious gazes. It was only once in the National Mall, almost deserted on this damp day, that they could finally speak freely. "How is this possible?" she asked without preamble. "You were supposed to be in Dubai for 5 years. Fate is sometimes generous to those who have learned patience," he responded enigmatically. Then, facing her insistent gaze, "My Middle Eastern investors were impressed by my ability to restructure their projects. In 6 months, I accomplished what they hoped for in 2 years. They offered me a contract modification, international consultant, rather than permanent resident. And the foundation? Mine. The admission was simple, direct, created with part of the fees I received, dedicated exclusively to written heritage preservation, manuscripts, archives, ancient libraries." Eleanor stopped in the middle of a mall path, wet leaves crunching under her feet. "You did all this for me?" "For us," he gently corrected, "to create common ground where our passions and our lives could meet without compromise or sacrifice." The rain began again, light and almost warm. Neither made a move to seek shelter. "I rethought that conversation in the chalet," he continued, "our resignation to choices that seemed imposed on us, and I realized I had spent my life transforming constraints into opportunities, except that time, precisely when it mattered most." The raindrops slid down his face like tears neither dared to shed. "For 8 months I worked with a single objective," he continued, "to create a bridge between our worlds. A project where your expertise would be indispensable, where my contribution would have meaning, where we could build something together professionally and—" He left his sentence hanging, suddenly vulnerable despite his imposing stature. "And personally," she completed, her heart beating. "If you still wish it," he murmured. In response, Eleanor crossed the space still separating them and placed her hands on his face. Her fingers traced the contour of his cheekbones, his jaw, relearning this intimate geography that time had slightly altered. 8 months, she breathed. "Each day, I composed letters I never sent you." "Why?" he asked, his hand finding hers. "Because I wanted to read them to you in person someday, when the time came." Their lips finally found each other, under the Washington rain that transformed the world around them into a watercolor with blurred contours. This kiss tasted of rewarded patience, overcome obstacles, and promises finally free to be kept. When they separated, Thaddeus's smile had a luminosity she had never seen before. "I have an apartment a short walk from here," he revealed. "I purchased it 3 months ago in anticipation of this day." "So confident," she teased him, despite the emotion constricting her throat. "So determined," he corrected. "To create the conditions for our story to have a chance." Eleanor felt something bloom within her, not a simple hope, but a quiet certainty that foundations had been laid to build something that would transcend time, distance, and circumstances that had almost separated them. "Show me," she said simply, intertwining her fingers with his. Hand in hand, they walked away under the rain that washed away the past and nourished the seeds of a future they were now free to imagine together. The Washington autumn deployed its palette of ochres and amber along the Potomac. From the window of their apartment in Georgetown, an elegant compromise between their two worlds, acquired 3 months after their reunion, Eleanor observed Thaddeus crossing the cobbled square, carrying a carefully wrapped small package. Their shared life had built gradually, with the deliberate patience of those who know solid foundations require time. The medieval wing renovation project was advancing, combining Eleanor's historical expertise and Thaddeus's architectural vision in a synergy their colleagues observed with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "A package arrived for you," Thaddeus announced upon entering, shaking dead leaves from his coat. "From Boston." Eleanor took the small box with surprise. The sender was Professor Harrington, her former director at the Morgan Library. "News from your former kingdom?" Thaddeus asked, preparing tea in the open kitchen. "Apparently." She carefully opened the package, discovering a handwritten letter and a small midnight blue velvet case. The letter, written in Harrington's characteristically pompous style, informed her that the library had finally been renovated. With a considerably reduced budget and without the initial ambition, but nonetheless completed. An inauguration was planned for the following month, and her presence, as well as Mr. Montgomery's, would be welcomed with the greatest consideration. The case, the letter continued, contained an artifact discovered during the work, behind a stone removed from the old monastic structure. An artifact that, according to consulted experts, may have belonged to the family of William Montgomery, the original monastery's benefactor. With slightly trembling fingers, Eleanor opened the case. On a silk cushion rested a signet ring in blackened silver, bearing a partially erased coat of arms engraved by the centuries. "Thaddeus," she called softly, "come see." He approached, curious, then froze upon seeing the ring. With an almost religious reverence, he took it between his fingers, examining it in the golden light filtering through the small paned windows. "The Montgomery emblem," he murmured, stunned. "The 3 wheat stalks and the star. It is indeed our family seal." 8 centuries, Eleanor breathed. "It remained hidden there for 800 years, waiting to be discovered." "As if the past were signaling to us," he responded, an unusual emotion vibrating in his voice. "As if this story had never really been interrupted." He slipped the ring onto his pinky, the only finger thin enough to accommodate it, and the ancient metal seemed to come alive at contact with his skin, as if a cycle were finally completing itself. "We should go," he suddenly said, "to this inauguration." Eleanor looked at him with surprise. Thaddeus had carefully avoided Boston since their reunion, as if the city still bore the stigmata of his financial failure. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "Your children might be present, some of your former detractors too." A serene smile illuminated his face, so different from the tormented man she had found in that Colorado chalet. "It's time to close the circle," he said simply, "to honor the past to better embrace the future." The phone's ring interrupted this emotion-laden moment. It was Vanessa, her colleague from the Library of Congress, unusually agitated. "You'll never guess," she exclaimed without preamble. "The committee just approved your appointment as chief curator of the new Illuminated Manuscripts Department. It's been official for 10 minutes. The news left Eleanor speechless. This promotion, which she hadn't expected for several years, represented an exceptional professional recognition for someone her age. "It's unexpected," she stammered. "Not really," Vanessa replied with a laugh. "Your expertise is indisputable, and then your project for ultra-high-definition digitization of illuminations won over even the most traditionalist committee members, not to mention the support of your mysterious benefactor." "Thaddeus had nothing to do with this decision," Eleanor protested, suddenly defensive. "Of course not," Vanessa quickly conceded. "He didn't even participate in the final vote. I was just teasing." "You deserve it, Eleanor, truly." After hanging up, she turned to Thaddeus, who had discreetly moved away during the conversation. "You knew?" she asked directly. "About the committee's decision?" "Yes," he admitted straightforwardly. "About today's announcement? No." And you said nothing. It wasn't my place to do so. He approached, taking her hands in his, and contrary to what you seem to fear, I exerted no influence. I left the room when your file was presented, and only resumed my seat after the vote. The sincerity in his eyes immediately dissipated her passing wariness. Forgive me, she murmured. Sometimes old reflexes resurface. The fear of being indebted? He guessed with a perspicacity that no longer surprised Eleanor. The fear of not deserving what happens to me, she gently corrected. Whether it's a promotion, or you. Thaddeus framed her face with his hands with infinite tenderness. If you could see yourself through my eyes, if only for a moment, this fear would never exist again. On the coffee table, the ancient Montgomery signet captured a ray of sunshine, projecting a silver gleam on the wall like a complicit wink from history. Then we'll go to Boston, Eleanor decided, to celebrate the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Together, Thaddeus completed. This simple word, pronounced with quiet confidence, contained all the promises they no longer needed to explicitly formulate. The path traveled since their first meeting on that linden-scented terrace had transformed two solitudes into an alliance that transcended mere romance, a mutual recognition of two souls who, despite differences in age and experience, had found in the other a reflection of their deepest aspirations. Outside, Washington was gently donning evening colors, and on Georgetown streets, shadows lengthened as if to remind that time, this patient sculptor, was shaping their story with the same delicacy with which it had polished the Morgan Library's stone through centuries. The golden light of the New England sun caressed Boston's ochre facades, so different from Washington's more silvery luminosity. Eleanor felt her heart accelerate as their rental car crossed the city's ancient boundaries. Strange sensation of return, she murmured, her gaze capturing the subtle changes in the city she had left more than a year ago. Thaddeus, at the wheel, nodded silently. His face had imperceptibly tensed as they approached their destination, this city where he had known so much success, then such a brutal fall. The hotel they had chosen, deliberately different from the Fairmont Copley Plaza where they had met, offered an unparalleled view of Boston Common. In their suite with light tones, Eleanor slowly unpacked their things, savoring this strange sensation of returning to familiar territory with a transformed identity. The reception begins in 2 hours, she gently reminded Thaddeus, who contemplated the city from the window, lost in his thoughts. He turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Are you ready to face all those curious gazes? The barely veiled questions about our relationship? The suppositions about my involvement in your career? I am if you are, she responded simply. We have nothing to prove, Thaddeus, nor to justify. He approached, taking her hands in his with that reverence which, even after months of intimacy, still made her shiver. I received a message from Griffin, he revealed. He'll be present tonight, with his sister Phoebe. This information surprised her. Thaddeus's relationships with his children remained strained, despite some reconciliation attempts in recent months. That's a good thing, isn't it? She asked cautiously. Perhaps. The uncertainty in his voice betrayed still living wounds. They wish to meet us before the reception, to discuss. The us didn't escape Eleanor. It was the first time Thaddeus's children expressed an explicit desire to meet her. An hour later, they were seated in a private salon of the hotel bar, the atmosphere charged with palpable tension. Griffin, whom Eleanor hadn't seen since that decisive conversation in the Boston Garden, seemed to have aged several years. At his side, Phoebe, an elegant woman in her 30s with a wary gaze, observed Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. Thank you for accepting this meeting, Griffin began with a formality that underscored the emotional gap between them. I should be thanking you, Eleanor responded gently. Without your intervention last year, I might never have found your father in Colorado. An uncomfortable silence followed this direct remark. Phoebe, who hadn't yet spoken a word, seemed to be evaluating Eleanor as one would examine a rare specimen in a laboratory. We made mistakes, Griffin finally admitted, avoiding Thaddeus's gaze. Serious mistakes motivated by misplaced concerns. What my brother is trying to awkwardly express, Phoebe intervened in a clear, precise voice, is that we wish to apologize to both of you. Thaddeus, who had remained silent, appeared genuinely surprised. Apologies. We acted out of fear, Phoebe continued, more direct than her brother. Fear of losing our inheritance, certainly, but also fear of losing you, Dad. Since Mom's death, you had withdrawn so much into yourself, so invested in these restoration projects, as if you were trying to rebuild something that couldn't be rebuilt. And when we saw you becoming attached to someone new, Griffin added, someone young, brilliant. You thought I was a fortune hunter, Eleanor completed without animosity. It was more complicated than that, Phoebe nuanced. We saw how this relationship transformed you, gave you back an energy we hadn't seen for years, and that's precisely what frightened us. You were afraid I would change, Thaddeus understood, his voice softened by this revelation. That you would become someone we wouldn't recognize anymore, Griffin confirmed, someone who would no longer need us. The brutal honesty of this confession created a silence charged with emotion. Eleanor felt Thaddeus's hand seek hers under the table, a discreet but significant gesture. What we want to say, Phoebe resumed after a moment, is that we've observed from afar what you've built together this past year. The projects you develop, the foundation, your partnership, and we understood we were wrong. We would like to be part of this new life, Griffin concluded, with a vulnerability that suddenly reminded Eleanor of Thaddeus. If you're ready to give us a second chance. Thaddeus seemed unable to speak, emotion visibly knotting his throat. It was Eleanor who responded, carefully choosing her words. Second chances are precious, she said gently. I myself received one when I most needed it. I believe it's for your father to decide, but know that on my side there's no rancor. The look Thaddeus gave her was imbued with deep gratitude. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, he stood and opened his arms. His children rushed into them in an awkward but sincere embrace, the first breach in a wall of resentment erected over years. Eleanor observed them, moved but respectful of this family moment, when Phoebe suddenly extended her hand in her direction, silently inviting her to join them. This simple gesture, inclusion in a circle from which she had been so explicitly excluded before, perhaps represented the most beautiful recognition. Later, as they prepared for the official ceremony, Thaddeus seemed transformed, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Thank you, he said simply, helping her fasten the delicate pearl necklace that completed her outfit. For what? She asked, meeting his gaze in the mirror. For showing my children what I myself had forgotten, that mistakes don't define who we are, and that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. The ceremony at the Morgan Library was both familiar and strangely new. The spaces Eleanor had known intimately had been transformed, less spectacularly than in Thaddeus's original project, but with a sensitivity that respected the place's spirit. When they entered, a murmur ran through the assembly. Thaddeus Montgomery and Eleanor Blackwood, whose professional and personal story had fueled Boston conversations for months, were making their first public appearance as a couple in the city where everything had begun. Professor Harrington welcomed them with a deference that would have seemed comical had it not been so sincere. Vivian, now deputy director, came to greet Eleanor with a warmth suggesting time had eased old rivalries. You look happy, she observed simply. I am, Eleanor confirmed. Differently than I imagined, but deeply. The official speech, the applause, the champagne, everything seemed to belong to a social ritual in which they were both participants and observers. The true celebration was unfolding in these exchanged glances, these hands discreetly seeking each other, this silent complicity that seemed to say, we've passed through fire and emerged stronger. In the main hall, under the new glass ceiling flooding the space with light, Thaddeus briefly slipped away to speak with his children. Eleanor took the opportunity to approach the special exhibition dedicated to the building's history. Under a secure display case stood Brother Thomas's journal that Thaddeus had shown her that night in his mansion, beside the signet ring discovered in the walls. A repeating history, isn't it? Thaddeus's voice made her turn. He stood there, delicately holding a champagne flute, his gaze fixed on the artifacts. Or one that continues, she suggested. I have something for you, he said softly, extracting a small case from his jacket pocket. A symbol, if you'll accept it. Inside rested a ring, not an ostentatious diamond, but a delicate gold band, on which was engraved in miniature the same symbol as on the medieval signet ring, the 3 wheat stalks and star of the Montgomerys. "It's not a marriage proposal," he specified with a smile. "Not yet, it's a promise. That whatever story we write together, it will honor that which preceded us while tracing its own path." Eleanor felt tears rise to her eyes as he gently slipped the ring onto her finger. Around them, the library seemed to vibrate with a particular energy, as if the centuries of knowledge preserved within its walls silently approved this alliance that transcended time. "I accept this promise," she murmured, "and make one in return. That our lives, like these books we cherish, be stories where each chapter, even the darkest, contributes to the beauty of the whole." Their gazes met in a mutual understanding that surpassed words. In a few hours, they would return to Washington, to their shared projects and shared life. But this moment in Boston, this return to the sources of their meeting, would remain engraved in them as proof that endings are sometimes only disguised beginnings, and that ruins can become the foundations of the most beautiful reconstructions. 2 years later, the New England house was gently awakening under the dawn light. Light mists floated above the river, serpentining below, giving the landscape the air of an impressionist painting. In the garden, the antique roses Eleanor had planted the previous summer were beginning to open, their fragrance mingling with the scent of damp earth. It was her grandmother's legacy, this small rural property she had almost sold during Thaddeus's financial crisis, that had become their refuge, their haven far from Washington's bustle. The old golden stone building had been restored with patience and respect, becoming the tangible symbol of their shared philosophy, honoring the past while delicately adapting it to present needs. Eleanor, seated at the massive wooden table on the terrace, contemplated the open manuscript before her, a personal project she had been pursuing for months, a love story across centuries, inspired by their own journey and the ancient tales she had spent her professional life preserving. "Still at work before sunrise?" Thaddeus's voice made her smile. He appeared on the terrace, 2 steaming coffee cups in hand, his hair now almost entirely grey, but his gaze as lively as ever. "Inspiration comes when the world is still silent," she responded, gratefully accepting the cup he extended. He sat across from her, tenderly observing the subtle changes in her appearance. At 26, Eleanor had gained a quiet confidence that transpired in her posture, in the precision of her gestures, in the way she now fully occupied space. "The Foundation has confirmed funding for the Moroccan project," he announced after a moment of comfortable silence. "The Fez library can be entirely digitized and restored." "A new adventure," she smiled, knowing what this implied. Travel, challenges, discoveries. Their life had found a rhythm that resembled them, sharing their time between Washington, where they jointly directed the Foundation for Written Heritage Preservation, and this New England house where they recharged. The age difference that had prompted so many comments at the beginning had progressively faded in the balance of a partnership where each brought their unique strength. "Phoebe called last night," Thaddeus continued. "She and Jason will join us next week with the children." The reconciliation with his children had deepened over the months, transforming initial wariness into an adult relationship based on mutual respect. The birth of Phoebe's twins had completed the dissolution of the last resistances, offering Thaddeus a grandfather role in which he blossomed with evident joy. "And Griffin?" Eleanor asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it confirmed. "He's finishing his internship at the Alexandria Library and will join us directly in Morocco." A proud smile illuminated Thaddeus's face. Apparently, his project on Coptic manuscript conservation has impressed the director. Griffin's transformation from a young man obsessed with financial inheritance to a passionate cultural preservation advocate was perhaps the most beautiful symbol of their positive influence. Without pressure or expectation, simply through the example of their shared passion, a joyful cry interrupted them. On the house threshold stood a small figure in pajamas, tousled hair and eyes still swollen with sleep. "Mom, Dad, I saw a fox in the garden." Sophia, 4 years old, rushed toward them with the overflowing enthusiasm that characterized her. Eleanor welcomed her in her arms, inhaling the scent of sleep and innocence emanating from her daughter. "A fox? So early in the morning? You're lucky, darling," she responded, smoothing the rebellious curls. "I'll show you how to draw a fox," Thaddeus proposed, lifting the child to settle her on his knees. "Like in the medieval manuscripts Mom restores." Eleanor observed them, moved by this daily scene that nevertheless never ceased to touch her. Sophia, born 9 months after their return from Boston, conceived in the joy of reunion and reconciliation, was the living bridge between their worlds, carrying in her name the homage to Thaddeus's mother, and in her features a harmonious blend of their two faces. Their decision to have a child, made after long discussions where they had weighed every aspect of their age difference, had proved the most natural evolution. Thaddeus, who initially feared not seeing his daughter reach adulthood, had finally embraced this new fatherhood, with a serenity his experience conferred. "Look, Mom," Sophia exclaimed, proudly brandishing the drawing Thaddeus was patiently guiding. "It's a fox with a crown like in your stories." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the reference to the Roman de Renard manuscript she had adapted into children's tales. This transmission, from ancient stories to future generations, had become the beating heart of their shared mission. The morning unfolded in this gentle family routine they had constructed. Breakfast prepared together, projects discussed unhurriedly, Sophia's laughter punctuating their adult conversations. Later, while the child napped and Thaddeus had isolated himself for a telephone conference, Eleanor returned to her manuscript. The final pages awaited writing, the conclusion of a story that, like theirs, had traversed trials to reach unexpected harmony. Her pen, for she insisted on writing this personal work the old-fashioned way, with ink on paper, stopped on the page. How to conclude a story that continued to write itself each day? How to capture the essence of a love that had found its strength precisely in its capacity to evolve, adapt, grow in the interstices left by past wounds? She sensed more than heard Thaddeus approach behind her. His hands gently rested on her shoulders, that familiar gesture that conveyed so much without a word. "Seeking the ending?" he asked, perceiving as always the invisible obstacles slowing her creativity. "Seeking the words to say that certain stories have no end," she responded, "that they simply transform, like seasons." He bent, depositing a light kiss on the crown of her head. Like old stones that absorb daylight to restore it in darkness, this image, so perfectly aligned with their shared sensibility, triggered a creative spark within her. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and wrote the final page in one breath, the words flowing naturally like the river water below. It was not in grand gestures, nor in grandiose promises that their love found its true expression, but in this daily patience to rebuild, stone after stone, what time and circumstances attempted to separate. Like ancient manuscripts that survive the centuries by grace of the hands that preserve them, their story transcended initial wounds to become a living testimony to this simple truth, that love, in its purest essence, is a continuous act of restoration. She set down her pen, satisfied. Thaddeus read over her shoulder, his warm breath against her cheek. "It's us," he murmured, "and yet it's universal. Like the best manuscripts," she confirmed. "That once unique and part of a broader tradition." He circled the chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. The afternoon light caressed his face, accentuating the lines time had carved there, these expression marks that, far from diminishing him, conferred an even deeper beauty in Eleanor's eyes. "Marry me," he said simply. The request, coming after years of shared life, after a child, after so many trials overcome, caught her by surprise. "We don't need it," she responded gently. "Our commitment is already absolute." "Precisely," he smiled. "It's not out of necessity I ask, but from desire to celebrate what we've built, like another stone to our edifice." The architectural metaphor, so typical of Thaddeus, made her smile. Since their meeting, they had shared this common language where buildings, books, and lives intertwined in the same quest for meaning and beauty. "In that case," she responded, "my answer is yes. One more stone together." In the distance, the village steeple struck 4, and as if echoing this signal, Sophia's voice reached them from inside the house, announcing the end of her nap and the beginning of a new sequence in the rhythm of their day. They exchanged a complicit glance, that gaze which, after all these years, still contained the same mutual recognition as on the first day, on that linden-scented terrace in Boston. A recognition that said, "I see you, not as you appear to others, but as you truly are, with your strengths and frailties." Thaddeus rose, extending his hand to help her rise in turn, a courteous gesture become ritual between them. Together they returned toward the house where their daughter awaited them, ready for new adventures. The light of this summer day illuminated the old dwelling, highlighting the beauty of the stones patinated by centuries. Like their love, it had resisted time, not by remaining immutable, but by absorbing changes to strengthen itself. And in this light, in this house between past and present, in this family they had created against all expectations, Eleanor and Thaddeus continued to write, day after day, the story they had chosen to share. A story where differences in age and experience faded before the power of a connection that had transformed two solitudes into a harmonious and resilient dance. For true love stories, Eleanor had written in the final lines of her manuscript, never really end. They simply become an integral part of life's great book, their pages turned by the hands of time, their words resonating across generations as a testimony to this eternal truth, that in authentic love there are neither winners nor losers, only two souls who choose day after day to grow together in the light.